She arrived without making a sound and no status. No big name, no promises, just a pair of attentive eyes, a steady heart, and one silent purpose: to care for the one no one else truly listened to. Pausa brief. Musica emotional suave intro. To most, she was just the nanny. Another face, another name. But to a child wrapped in silence, she became the first voice. And to a man scarred by loss and buried in cold routines, she became the first gaze that didn't demand anything. It simply saw him. Pausa. Cicero emotional. What started as just a job slowly became something else. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't beg to be loved. She stayed, and in the silence she honored, he learned to become everything money had never taught him to be. This isn't a fairy tale, it's a story built from pain, from broken pieces slowly rearranged by choice, not chance. That a story about listening, about love, the kind that doesn't arrive shouting, but stays in silence, in presence, and changes everything. The sound of the intercom broke the silence of the mansion. Amber adjusted the strap of her backpack on her shoulder, her heart beating harder than she'd like to admit. The iron gate opened slowly, revealing a long cobblestone driveway lined with perfectly trimmed trees. Everything seemed impeccable, cold, as if time had been calibrated not to leave any trace of life. She walked to the front door, unsure if she would be welcomed. The ad said urgent, but offered no details, just an address, a contact name, and one clear demand: discretion. When the door opened, it wasn't the father, nor a butler, but a previous nanny who greeted her with urgency in her eyes and a suitcase in hand. "Good luck," the woman whispered before disappearing without even looking back. Amber stepped inside, cautiously taking in the house. White marble floors, modern furniture, everything in perfect order. And yet, something ached. An absence filled the corners, the kind of emptiness that wasn't physical, but emotional. As she climbed the stairs toward the child's room, she had no idea what she'd find. But the moment she pushed the half-open door, her stomach tightened. There he was, sitting in the corner of the room, hugging a worn-out teddy bear, eyes wide with fear. He couldn't be more than 5 years old. Messy brown hair, wrinkled pajamas, and a look that said more than any words ever could. This boy was alone, even surrounded by luxury. She knelt slowly, respecting his space. "Hi, my name is Amber. Can I stay here with you for a little while?" The boy didn't respond, but he didn't run either. A small victory. She knew how to recognize trauma. Working with hurt children wasn't new to her, but she had never felt such a deep weight on a first meeting. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Amber turned and found herself face to face with a tall man in a dark suit, composed expression, and cold eyes. "You're the new nanny?" he asked, not even glancing at the boy. Amber stood up, keeping a steady tone. "Yes, Amber Bennett." He nodded. "Mason Reed," and walked away, as if looking at his own son was too uncomfortable. That night, as she tucked the boy into bed, Amber realized this house held more than just silence. It held an emotionally absent father, a boy who no longer cried, and a past no one dared to name. But she had one principle: never let a child go unseen. And if that meant confronting the coldest man she'd ever met, she would. Mason watched everything from the security cameras. He saw when she lay down on the carpet just to be at his son's level. Saw when she read an improvised book by flashlight, just to get a tiny smile. And for the first time in a long while, something stirred inside him. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't desire. It was something else. A discomfort. As if that woman was opening windows in a house he had deliberately kept shut. The next day, Amber found a note on the kitchen table. "Don't get your hopes up. He doesn't get attached." She smiled wryly and folded the paper carefully. "But I'll stay," she whispered to herself with the resolve of someone who refuses to be intimidated. Amber knew she was there for something bigger, and that Silence. She would listen until it spoke. She spent the rest of the morning discreetly exploring the house. Not out of curiosity, but instinct. Understanding the space meant understanding the voids. Every corner reflected more than wealth. It reflected absence. No pictures on the walls. No family photos. No kids' drawings. Just sophistication. And silence. The boy, whose name she learned was Liam, still didn't speak to her, but he began to watch her. When Amber organized the toys, he followed her with his eyes. When she made snacks, he lingered by the door, not entering, as if testing if she too would leave like all the others. And she understood. Abandonment, even unspoken, leaves deep marks. That afternoon, Amber took Liam out to the back garden. There was an old swing, half hidden among the trees. "Wanna try it?" she asked gently. He hesitated, but when he saw her sit down first, giggling as she swung her feet, he took a step forward. He didn't say a word, but he came closer. And that, to her, was answer enough. Mason watched from a distance, arms crossed on the upper floor balcony. He didn't trust nannies. They came and went like the wind. Some sought status, others opportunity. Deep down, he had given up believing anyone could truly love Liam. But Amber didn't seem to fit any mold. And maybe that's why the discomfort grew. That night, Amber ran into Mason in the hallway. He was coming from his office, eyes tired, still on his phone. "Dinner's ready," she said softly, unsure if she should speak. He looked at her, debating whether to respond. "I don't dine with employees," and walked past. Amber took a deep breath. She'd dealt with guarded men before, but few were frozen from the inside out. Later that night, Liam woke up crying from a nightmare. Amber went to his room immediately, sat beside him, and simply extended her hand. He held it, small, trembling, but firm. Amber didn't say a word. Sometimes, silence is the safest place for pain to rest. And that night, Liam fell asleep with her hand in his. The first sign of trust. The next day, a well-dressed woman arrived. Expensive heels, strong perfume, cold smile. "Meredith, Mason's personal assistant. I'm here to finalize the contract." Nothing friendly, just terms and schedules. Amber signed without complaint, but noticed the look of disdain, as if she were just another disposable one. After Meredith left, Amber found a box in the playroom labeled "Do Not Open." Curiosity 1. Inside were old drawings, a photo of baby Liam in the arms of a red-haired woman, and a folded note in firm handwriting. "Promise me you'll take care of him." Amber shivered. This wasn't just a job. It was a cry for help. That night, while Liam slept, Amber sat by the window of her small room and looked up at the dark sky. She thought about the mother she lost, the job she'd passed through, and the vow she once made, that wherever she was, she would make a difference. She wouldn't let anyone be invisible. And Liam needed more than care. He needed someone who would stay. Mason passed her in the hallway shortly after midnight. He saw her by the window, her face softly lit by moonlight. For a moment, their eyes met. He thought of saying something, but didn't. He just kept walking in silence. But Amber felt the weight of that glance. Something was broken in him. Something she strangely wanted to understand. And deep down, without even realizing it, Amber had already started to change everything. Not with commands, not with speeches, but with the quiet presence of someone who doesn't give up, even when no one else believes. Mason Reed didn't know when he had started avoiding his son's eyes. Maybe since the funeral, or maybe since the last "Daddy," the boy whispered before realizing he would never get an answer. The CEO of one of the largest tech companies on the East Coast knew how to run boardrooms, predict markets, close billion-dollar deals. But he didn't know how to sit on the floor and ask his son how he was doing. He had convinced himself that physical presence was enough, that providing safety, comfort, a luxurious home, and the best doctors would be sufficient. It was easier to delegate care than to face the pain that came with affection. That's why every new nanny was a relief, and everyone who left A confirmation that no one ever stayed, but Amber was different. She didn't flatter him. She didn't fear him. And she didn't try to get close out of interest. She seemed indifferent to his power. She simply did her job with a disarming calm, and in the process, made the boy smile again. Mason watched her with growing curiosity. And secretly, with envy. On Tuesday morning, Amber walked into the living room and found Mason alone, reviewing paperwork. He had no jacket on, his sleeves rolled up, half a cup of coffee beside him. She hesitated. "Your son asked why you never come down for breakfast." He looked up, surprised. He asked. Amber nodded. Children notice when they're not a priority. The sentence lingered in the air like something inappropriate, but true. Mason didn't answer. He just returned to his papers. But that night, when his son woke up from a nightmare and called for Amber between sobs, Mason felt something tighten in his chest. For a moment, her name had replaced his, and that hurt more than he was willing to admit. Amber noticed the effort. The next day, Mason appeared in the kitchen just before breakfast. He didn't say a word, just served himself and stood by the counter. The boy, surprised, lowered his milk and simply stared. Amber smiled gently and broke the silence. "We have pancakes. He likes them with strawberries." It was the first quiet family meal, but it was a beginning. Later that day, Amber took the boy to a community playground in the old part of town. He ran between the trees, laughing, freer than he'd ever been. Mason showed up unexpectedly. From a distance, he watched his son playing, and Amber sitting on a bench, chatting with other moms. For the first time, he saw his son as a normal child, and it disarmed him. One of the mothers approached Amber, discreetly pointing at Mason. "Is that your husband?" Amber almost laughed. "No, just my boss." But the woman continued. "He looks like someone who never smiles. Careful with that one." Amber just smiled. If they only knew that man was a fortress in ruins, maybe they wouldn't speak with such contempt. That on the way back, in the car, Mason broke the silence. "Why did you bring him here?" Amber looked through the mirror. "Because he needs to live. And the world doesn't exist only inside those walls." Mason took a deep breath, but didn't argue. Deep down, he knew she was right. And he began to wonder when he had stopped living too. The days passed with small changes. The boy began to speak more. Amber started leaving notes with short phrases in his room. "You matter, I'm here. If you want to talk, I'm listening." Mason found them once, and stood still reading each one, as if trying to understand a language he had forgotten. At a tea night, Amber read him stories about courage, about fathers who learned to love, about homes made of presents, not walls. Mason, hidden behind the door, listened, and for the first time in years, he cried in silence. Not from sadness, but from a bitter recognition. He didn't know how to be a father, but he wanted to learn. A rainy Saturday brought an unexpected challenge. Liam fell in the hallway while running toward the stairs. Amber ran to him immediately, knelt down, and held him firmly and gently. As she cleaned the scraped knee with care, he cried silently against her chest. "It's okay. I'm here," she whispered, with a voice that healed more than any medicine. Mason appeared in the doorway, tense. He saw his son clinging to Amber, softly sobbing. When he tried to approach, Liam hid behind her. "You weren't there," the boy said, his voice trembling. The phrase, spoken with innocent cruelty, cut through Mason like a blade. He stood frozen, choking on guilt. Amber looked at him, not accusingly, but not softly either. "He doesn't need a hero. He needs a father." That's all she said before turning back to calm Liam. Mason didn't respond. He just knelt beside them. He tried to run a hand through his son's hair, clumsily, but with an almost childlike sincerity. Liam, after a brief hesitation, allowed the touch. From that night on, something changed. Mason began coming home earlier. Little by little, he replaced silence with listening. He started asking small questions. Did he sleep well? What did he enjoy eating today? Do you think he's calmer? Amber answered naturally. And Mason listened carefully, like someone relearning a forgotten language. One night, he found her in the garden, sitting under the tree Liam had started calling our hiding place. Amber had a notebook on her lap, writing by the porch. "Light, what do you write so much?" he asked, curious. She didn't flinch. She smiled. "Letters to myself. They help me remember who I am, even when the world tries to erase me." He sat beside her. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was intimate. "I used to write letters too, before I lost the ability to believe anyone would answer." Amber didn't ask who he lost. She knew some pains don't need questions, only presence. And in that moment, she chose to stay. The next day, Mason took Liam to school for the first time. Amber walked beside them in silence, watching the boy hold his father's hand more firmly than before. "He's going to be okay," Amber said before stepping away. Mason looked at her as if those words meant more than any advice he'd ever received. Back home, Amber found an envelope on her bed. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for showing me what really matters." It was Mason's handwriting. She held the paper for a while, feeling the letters like someone feeling a promise being born. She knew there was still a long way to go, but now, there was a beginning, and it was there, in small gestures and welcomed silences, that a new story was being written, not with haste, but with presence. Amber began to realize that there was more to that house than cold walls and well-rehearsed routines. There were doors that never opened, subjects never mentioned, and silences louder than any conversation. Even with the visible progress between Mason and Liam, something in the air remained heavy, as if they were all dancing around a pain no one dared to name. One night, Liam asked softly, "Amber, where did my mom go?" She paused, took a deep breath. She went to a very beautiful place and left behind the most beautiful smile I've ever seen. Yours. He stayed quiet for a while. "Then why doesn't Daddy talk about her?" Amber knelt down to meet his eyes. "Because sometimes, when the pain is too big, we think if we don't speak, it will disappear." Liam simply nodded, with a sadness far too deep for someone so small. The next day, Amber found Mason in his office. She was distracted, looking for a book for Liam, but stumbled upon something unexpected, an old photo fallen behind the bookshelf. It was Mason and a red-haired woman with bright eyes, smiling. She held baby Liam in her arms. Amber hesitated. When Mason entered and saw the photo in her hands, he froze. "Don't touch that," he said coldly. Amber apologized, but before leaving, looked at him with quiet firmness. "He deserves to know who she was." Mason turned away. "He doesn't need memories that will hurt him." Amber lowered her eyes. "But sometimes what hurts heals." And she left, placing the photo on his desk. Mason didn't touch it. Not yet. But he didn't throw it away either. That night, Mason stayed up late. He sat in his office armchair with the photo in hand. He remembered Emily's laughter, the way she ruffled his hair, the letters she wrote to Liam even before he was born. She had asked, shortly before she passed, that he keep telling Liam stories about her. But Mason had failed. He buried the pain with her body. The next morning, Mason came down for breakfast earlier than usual. Liam ran up to him with a drawing in hand. "I made it for you." Mason knelt down and took the paper. It was a house with 3 people, a man, a woman in a red dress, and a child in the middle. "That's Mommy," Liam explained. "Amber, help me remember." Mason looked at Amber, and for the first time, he didn't see an employee. He saw someone helping rebuild what he had once let crumble. Later, Amber sat on the porch with Liam, teaching him how to make soap bubbles. The boys' laughter filled the air. Mason watched them from afar. Amber wasn't trying to be a mother. She didn't intrude. She didn't force anything. She simply cared, with presence, with respect. And that, paradoxically, was what moved him the most. By late afternoon, Meredith showed up again. She brought papers for Mason to sign, and sharp remarks. "She looks pretty comfortable here, a little too much, don't you think?" Mason looked at her, not bothering to hide his discomfort. Amber is doing more for Liam than any of us, including me. Meredith didn't reply, but Amber heard from the kitchen, and something inside her settled. She never sought recognition, but being seen made it hurt less. That night, Amber made hot chocolate for Liam. Mason walked into the kitchen and, instead of leaving, sat at the table. They stayed quiet for a while, just listening to the rain outside. Then Mason spoke, almost in a whisper. Emily died 3 years ago. A rare cancer. When we found out, it was already too late. Amber stopped stirring the spoon, looked at him without interrupting. He continued. She asked me for 2 things: not to let Liam feel alone, and to tell him who she was. I failed at both. Amber handed him the cup, even though it wasn't for him. You still have time. Mason looked up, and in that moment, he wasn't a powerful CEO. He was just a man in ruins, trying to learn how to rebuild in the days that followed. Mason began telling stories to Liam. At first, it was hard. His voice trembled. There were long pauses. But Liam listened intently. Mommy liked to sing in the car, he'd say. She danced weird, but it made us laugh. And with every memory shared, both of them healed, step by step. Amber followed. Everything with care, without interfering. Just watching. One day, seeing Mason and Liam laughing in the garden, she allowed herself to smile too. A small, subtle smile, but one filled with the certainty that, no matter the scars, it was still possible to bloom there, but not everything was light. One day, Amber received a strange phone call while buying supplies for an activity with Liam. On the other end, a rough male voice. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. This family isn't what it seems. Before she could respond, the line went dead. She stood frozen, phone still in hand, heart racing. Something about that voice made her shiver. That night, Mason noticed Amber quieter than usual. Did something happen? She shook her head, but her eyes betrayed her. Just a tough day. He didn't press, but he felt it. And for the first time, it bothered him not to know how to protect her. Her silence affected him more than he cared to admit. Days later, Amber arrived home and found an envelope under her door. Inside was a photo of her and Liam at the park and a handwritten note. They won't let you stay. The world spun for a second. She sat on the bed, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't just intimidation. It was a veiled threat. And she knew she couldn't tell Mason yet. Still, Amber didn't back down. At dinner, she acted normal. Played with Liam, talked with Mason. But deep inside, her guard was up. Someone didn't want her there. And it wasn't just jealousy. It was something deeper, dirtier, more dangerous. Later, while tidying up toys with Liam, he asked, "Are you leaving too?" Amber knelt in front of him. "No, sweetheart. I'll only leave if you ask me to." He smiled, relieved. But Amber felt the weight of that promise. Now, more than ever, she had to stay. Not just for Liam, but for the truth that was starting to creep out from behind the curtains of that house. Mason, down the hall, overheard the conversation by accident, and something in his expression hardened. He didn't know about the notes, but he could feel shadows approaching. And if Amber were hurt, something inside him would collapse completely. Amber knew love begins in silence, but to protect would require courage. And she was ready. Amber woke up that morning with the feeling that something had changed. The sky was clear, the coffee had a comforting aroma, but the unease lingered. The anonymous photo left in her room wouldn't leave her mind. She knew she couldn't just ignore it, but she also didn't want to alarm Mason before understanding what was truly going on. At breakfast, Mason appeared lighter. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple shirt, and he seemed more present than ever. He sat beside Liam, asked about homework, and even laughed at one of his son's corny jokes. Amber watched everything with tenderness and a flicker of fear. What was about to be threatened was real. Later, while Liam was napping, Amber went out to pick up some supplies she had ordered. As she left the store, she noticed a black car that seemed to be following her. She tested her suspicion by turning down a different street, and the car followed. She quickened her pace, entered a crowded cafe, and didn't leave for almost an hour. When she returned home, the car was gone. But the feeling wasn't. Amber didn't tell Mason that night. He was smiling with Liam on his lap, both of them, working on a puzzle on the living room rug. She didn't want to steal that moment from them. But she wrote down the license plate number and hid the threatening note deep in a drawer. If the danger was real, she had to protect herself and protect them. The next day, Meredith showed up earlier than usual. She claimed she needed to discuss security matters with Mason, but Amber noticed something off. The assistant looked at her with a different kind of coldness, no longer arrogant, but knowing. And that made Amber freeze inside. Hours later, while Mason was out for a meeting, Amber took the opportunity to check the hallway security footage. She wanted to confirm the envelope had been left by someone from outside. But when she reviewed the footage, her heart stopped. Meredith. She was the one who had entered Amber's room with the envelope in hand. The betrayal burned. Meredith, always so polished and calculating, was involved. But why? What did she gain by driving Amber away? Amber sat in front of the screen, hands trembling. She needed to think clearly. Confronting Mason without solid proof was risky. And there was Liam. She couldn't afford to leave him vulnerable again. When Mason came home that evening, he found Amber in the garden with Liam in her arms, both gazing at the sky. "You seem distant," he said gently. Amber looked at him. "Sometimes things start screaming inside us, even when we try not to see them." He didn't quite understand, but he felt the weight of her words. "If something is going on, you can tell me." She hesitated. She wanted to trust him, but held back. "I know." In the days that followed, Mason noticed Amber was more withdrawn. Still affectionate with Liam, still kind with everyone, but something in her eyes had changed. "Do you still want to be here?" he asked one night as they tidied up Liam's toys together. Amber answered honestly, "I do. But staying doesn't always depend only on our will." Mason didn't push further, but a doubt started forming inside him. Was someone trying to drive her away? And why? His mind began to revisit old contracts, familiar names, deals, trusted people who maybe had never deserved that trust. And at the center of it all, one truth gnawed at him. He had never really looked behind his own curtains. The following afternoon, Amber received a call from her sister, who lived in another city. "You're on a gossip site." Amber frowned. "What?" Her sister explained. There was an article insinuating that Amber was taking advantage of Mason's emotional vulnerability to secure her place in the mansion, complete with unauthorized photos. Amber hung up with her heart racing. She rushed to the computer and found the article. There it was, her name, a photo of her in the garden with Liam and Mason, and twisted headlines. "The nanny who captured the tycoon. Secret romance or emotional manipulation?" The piece was cruel, sensationalist, and signed by a journalist she didn't know, but who shared Meredith's last name. That night, she couldn't eat. Mason noticed and insisted. "Amber, what's going on?" She tried to hold it in, but her eyes welled up. "Did you know they're slandering me?" His eyes widened. "What?" She turned the laptop toward him. This is what they're saying about me. About us." Mason stood in stunned silence for several seconds. Then he picked up the laptop, read every line, and stood up. "This is outrageous," he said through clenched teeth. "I'm going to fix it." Amber grabbed his arm. "It's not just about fixing it, Mason. It's about understanding where it came from. Who wants me gone and why?" He looked at her, guilt and frustration battling in his gaze. "I should have protected you." Amber took a deep breath. "You still can." The next morning, Mason called Meredith in for a private meeting. Amber didn't know what was said, but she saw the pale look on the assistant's face as she left. That same day, the article was taken down, and for the first time, Mason stood before all the household staff and said in a firm voice, "From now on, anyone who disrespects Amber is disrespecting me as well." Amber heard it from the top of the stairs, and though she was still hurt, Something inside her began to heal. It wasn't just protection. It was recognition. It was someone saying, "I see you." Later that day, Mason knocked on her door. "May I come in?" Amber nodded. He stood there, nervous. "I didn't see it before, but now, if you want to leave, I'll understand." She looked at him for a long moment, then said, softly but firmly, "I won't leave out of fear. I'll only leave by choice. And for now, I choose to stay." Mason stepped forward and gently touched her hand. "Thank you." And in that simple, restrained gesture, Amber understood. He still didn't know how to love, but he was trying to learn. And she still believed it was worth teaching him. Amber quietly closed the door after Mason left. She stood still for a while, looking at the forgotten cup of tea on her desk. The world felt like it had returned to place, even for just a few seconds, but she knew the cracks were still there, hidden beneath the surface. And even so, something within her chose to stay, not out of comfort, but out of conviction, because sometimes staying is the bravest thing someone can do. The next morning, Liam ran to her with a drawing in hand. "It's us," he said, beaming. Amber knelt down and looked at it with love. Herself, Mason, and Liam, holding hands beneath a yellow sky. "There's sunshine even when it's cloudy," he explained. Amber felt her eyes well up. Maybe that's what she meant to this house. A ray of light where there once was only shadow. And in that moment, she knew, no matter how the past tried to haunt them or fear knocked at their door, something new was beginning. Something that didn't need grand promises, but daily choices. Mason still had a long road ahead. So did she. And maybe, for the first time, they didn't have to walk it alone. Amber woke to the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway. When she opened the door, she found Liam holding a crumpled flower in his small hands. "It's for you," he said, his face glowing. "Because you're good." She knelt down and hugged him tightly. She didn't need anything else that morning. That gesture was enough to remind her why she stayed. Mason watched from a distance, leaning against the wall with a cup of coffee in his hand. There was something in his eyes, a blend of admiration and fear. He admired the lightness with which Amber filled every space, but he feared he'd never live up to what she awakened. He could offer protection, comfort, but what about the rest? The things money could never buy? That morning, the three of them went out together. Mason took them to a local fair where Liam could pick fruit, see people, play instruments. It was the first time they walked the streets like an almost family. People stared, but not with disdain, with curiosity. Amber felt the eyes on them, but didn't look away. That moment was too real to hide. While Liam played with a group of children in a music circle, Amber and Mason sat on a bench under a tree. "He looks like a different child," she said. "And you look like a different man," she added. Mason looked at her sincerely. "And you seem like someone who transforms everything she touches." The silence that followed was thick, but full of meaning. Later, in the car, Liam had fallen asleep in the back seat. Mason drove slowly, as if he didn't want the moment to end. "Do you think he'll forgive me one day?" he asked, eyes still on the road. Amber paused before answering. "He already is. With every hug, every smile." Mason swallowed hard. He wanted to believe it. When they got home, Mason carried Liam to his room. Amber stood in the doorway, watching. He covered the boy gently, adjusted his pillow, and lightly brushed his hair. Then he turned and met Amber's gaze. For the first time, he looked vulnerable. And at peace. In the hallway, they paused for a moment. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was intimate. Mason broke it with a low voice. "I've never been afraid of losing money, but I am afraid of losing this. You." Him. Amber felt her heart quicken. It wasn't a love declaration, but it was more honest than any rehearsed words. That night, Amber wrote in the notebook she always kept nearby. "Some connections don't begin with promises. They begin with presence. And his presence is growing stronger." It was the kind of feeling she didn't want to label, but she wanted to keep. because something was growing there, in the space between what wasn't yet, but could be. The following days passed quietly, almost too quietly, but sometimes peace is unsettling. Amber began to notice strange looks at the market, unread messages on her phone, interview invitations she had never accepted. The media seemed more interested than ever. And although Mason had removed Meredith, he still didn't know how far the exposure could go. One night, as Amber read to Liam in his room, Mason knocked on the door. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" She followed him to the office. He handed her a tablet with a new article. Photos of her with Liam and Mason, taken at the fair. Nanny becomes Tycoon's new favorite. She sighed. They always reduce women to strategy. Mason nodded, angry. This has to stop. But Amber touched his arm. And what if it doesn't? Mason looked at her. What do you mean? She answered firmly. What if this isn't just about control, but about destruction? He recoiled, as if unwilling to hear it. But she continued. Mason, someone wants to ruin your image. If it hurts me, I'll survive. But what about Liam? That question hit him like a punch to the gut. Liam, the boy for whom he was finally learning to become a better man. You're right. I need to protect you both. And for that, maybe I'll have to let go of some truths. Amber looked at him calmly. Or maybe you need to embrace them all at once. The next morning, Mason called for a press conference. Amber tried to convince him not to go, but he was resolute. I'm done hiding, and I'm done letting you take the fall for something that's mine. She watched from afar, saw him step onto the stage, adjust the microphone, and take a deep breath before speaking. I'm Mason Reed, he said, looking straight into the cameras. And today, I want to speak not as a businessman, but as a man. I have a son, an incredible boy, and for a long time, I was an absent, wounded, and scared father. But someone came into our lives and taught us how to listen again. Amber Bennett is not a scheme. She's a gift, and I refuse to let her be destroyed by speculation. Amber watched from home, tears in her eyes. Not for the words, but for the gesture, for the courage, for the way Mason, who always hid behind walls, had finally decided to tear them down for her. When Mason returned home, Amber was waiting in the living room. She walked up to him without saying a word, just hugged him. A full embrace, filled with everything they hadn't said. Mason held her tightly, as if that moment was the beginning of something that no longer needed to be held back. Liam appeared in the hallway, rubbing his eyes. Are you going to stay? Amber and Mason looked at each other. Amber smiled first. We're going to try, little one. Mason nodded. And this time, I'll stay too. And that night, while the world outside was still talking, inside that house silence became a new kind of home. One that shelters, listens, and welcomes those who choose to stay. That night, Amber couldn't sleep. She sat by the window in an armchair, wrapped in a blanket, her heart both light and restless. There was peace, but also vulnerability. She knew that loving someone like Mason meant walking on ground that was still learning to bloom. But now he was walking beside her, and that made all the difference. Across the house, Mason was also awake. He looked into Liam's room through the slightly open door. Inside, his son slept with arms spread wide, peaceful. Mason closed his eyes for a moment and whispered, almost to himself, "Thank you for not giving up on us." And in that shared silence, without needing words, something deep was sealed between the three of them. A bond made not of promises, but of presence. Amber woke up to the soft smell of fresh bread coming from the kitchen. When she walked downstairs, she found Mason wearing a crooked apron, trying not to burn his fingers while pulling out a tray of bread. She smiled. Well, this is new. He looked up, surprised and proud. I promised Liam I'd make breakfast today. And for the first time, it felt natural to see him there, fully present. Liam showed up moments later, still in pajamas, laughing at the sight of his dad, all flustered. You're funny, Daddy. Mason scooped him up with ease. And you're my official pancake assistant. Amber watched the scene, with her heart tightening in the best way. That was the kind of memory that lasts, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. After breakfast, they went together to a small craft fair. Amber suggested Liam choose something for his room. He pointed to a wooden sign that read, "Love lives here." Mason offered to pay, but Liam walked up to the woman at the booth and handed over the coins from his piggy bank. "It's for our house," he said. Amber held back tears. It was just a sign, but it said everything. That afternoon, while tidying up Liam's room, Amber stumbled across something unexpected, a small blue box hidden behind the books. Inside were old newspaper clippings, photos of her and Liam, and a beaded bracelet with letters spelling AMBR. At the bottom, a note in childish handwriting. "If she leaves, I'll miss her a lot." Amber sank to the floor, unable to hold back her tears. Later, she showed it to Mason. He took the box carefully, as if holding something too fragile to touch. "I didn't even know he did this." Amber nodded. "He understands connection more than we think." Mason ran his fingers over the bracelet. "And I'm only beginning to understand now." Amber looked at him gently. "It's never too late." That evening, while Liam napped, Amber and Mason stepped out into the garden. The sun was setting, painting the sky in golden hues. She kicked off her shoes and stepped barefoot into the grass, feeling the cool earth beneath her feet. Mason did the same. For a while, they just stood there in silence. And in that moment, between rustling branches and the whispering wind, no words were needed. Then Mason spoke, slowly. "You know what scared me most?" Amber looked at him, waiting. "That someone would come into my life and make me feel again." She said nothing. He went on. "But you didn't force it. You stayed. You looked at me even when I didn't know how to look back. And that taught me more than any self-help book I ever read in secret." Amber chuckled softly. "You read self-help?" Mason shrugged, sheepishly. "I was trying to understand why everything hurts so much." She stepped closer and gently touched his hand. "Sometimes, the real healing isn't in the answers. It's in the listening." He gave her fingers a light squeeze. "And you listened to me, even when I said nothing." That night, Amber was the one to read Liam his bedtime story. He asked Mason to stay, too. The three of them squeezed onto the bed, happy and close. Amber read slowly, and Mason watched, her with quiet admiration. When Liam finally drifted off to sleep, Mason remained there for a few extra minutes, as if trying to seal the moment into his heart. A home built in layers. Outside, Amber waited for him on the porch. He joined her, standing silently at her side. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Amber nodded. "Why did you stay when everything seemed to push you away?" She took a deep breath. "Because I saw something here that no one else did. And because I promised myself that one day I'd stay for love, not obligation." The words hit Mason hard. He didn't answer right away. He simply took her hand, gently drawing closer. There was no rush, no impulse. When their lips met, it was like the reunion of two souls that had waited far too long and finally recognized each other. The kiss was quiet, true, full of silence and meaning. The next day, a photo of the kiss taken by a paparazzo was already making rounds online. Amber saw it first. Mason arrived moments later, ready to handle the fallout. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have seen this coming." Amber closed the laptop. "I knew love with you wouldn't be quiet." He cupped her face. "But it will always be honest." Mason called another press conference, but this time, not to explain, just to say, "What we have is ours. And if the world wants to look, let it. But it won't decide who I love." Amber wasn't there in person, but she watched from home and cried, because now he wasn't just choosing her. He was standing by her, in front of everyone. Later that evening, Mason came home with flowers. Liam greeted him at the door with a drawing. The three of them, holding hands, in front of a house with a sign on the roof. "Love lives here." Mason knelt down and hugged him tightly. "You made this for us?" Liam nodded. because now we're a team. That night, Mason cooked dinner. It didn't turn out perfectly. The pasta was overcooked, the sauce too salty, but no one complained. They laughed, teased, toasted with grape juice. It was the first night of a home that didn't need luxury, only connection. And at last, there was abundance. Amber wrote in her notebook, "Some things only love can teach." How? To listen without rushing, stay without promising, love without invading, and just be without needing to explain. And in that gentle rhythm, between simplicity and presence, Mason, Amber, and Liam discovered that love wasn't a prize. It was a practice, one step at a time, one gesture each day, and every day, a new reason to stay. Later, as Amber closed the windows of the house, Mason came up behind her and embraced her silently. She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of presence and the calm of someone who no longer needed to protect themselves from what they felt. There, in the hush of the night and the faint scent of lavender in the air, they knew. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was even more beautiful. It was real. Liam slept deeply in the next room, still wearing the amber bracelet on his wrist, a peaceful smile on his face. On the floor, his drawings were scattered like a portrait of what the house had become, full of color, of effort, of imperfect but whole love. And even if the world outside still judged them, inside, there was peace. Amber looked at Mason one last time before turning off the lights. "Thank you for learning with me," she said softly. He took her hand and replied, "Eyes steady. You didn't just teach me how to love. You taught me how to stay." And when silence settled in, it wasn't empty. It was home. The morning began under a gray sky and strong wind, like a silent warning that something was coming. Amber was making coffee when Mason's phone rang. On the other end, a tense voice from the company's legal team. "We need you to come." And immediately, "There's an accusation against you involving misuse of the foundation's funds." Mason frowned. "That's absurd." But the news hit like a punch. Amber overheard the conversation from the kitchen, watching from afar. Mason hung up and rubbed his face, deep in thought. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. She approached, gently. "Want to tell me?" He hesitated. "Someone's trying to take me down, and they're using the foundation as a pretext." The very project Amber had helped design, the one she and Liam had poured their afternoons into, was now at the center of a scandal. That afternoon, Mason went to the company. Amber stayed home with Liam, doing her best to keep their routine normal. But inside, her heart beat unevenly. She knew this wasn't a random error. Someone was trying to break them down. Someone who knew their weaknesses and was willing to use anything against them. Hours later, Mason came back with heavy shoulders and a distant look in his eyes. "They've got forged documents. The signature isn't mine, but it looks real." Amber sat beside him on the couch. "Do you trust anyone in there?" Mason shook his head. "I thought I did, but now, I'm not so sure." She reached for his hand. "We'll find out who's behind this together." In the following days, the media exploded. Headlines accused Mason of fraud and speculation. About Amber resurfaced. The nanny at the center of a $1 million scandal. Amber tried to stay strong, mostly for Liam. But every published word felt like a dagger. Mason called in a legal team, but the battle was now one of narrative. And in that field, they were at a disadvantage. Liam sensed the tension, even if no one said a word. "What's going on, Amber?" he asked. She paused, kneeling beside him. "Sometimes, bad people try to do bad things to good people. But the truth always shows up, my love." He looked thoughtful. "Are you going away?" The question made her eyes water. "Only if it's to fight for you." While Mason tried to keep the company afloat, Amber decided to act on her own. She remembered the foundation's internal cameras, notes taken during early meetings, names mentioned behind closed doors. She began putting together an informal dossier, with help from a former coordinator who'd been fired for reporting irregularities. Months before Amber had even arrived, in the middle of her investigation, Amber uncovered something that changed everything. A digital signature used on the forged documents had been generated from Meredith's login, Mason's former assistant. She brought the information straight to him. It was her. Everything's here. Mason stared at the data, stunned. She always had access to my files. I trusted her. With the evidence in hand, Mason called his attorneys. But before that, he went to Meredith directly. She greeted him with her usual coldness. "You never saw me, Mason. It was always the nanny, the kid, the pain. Never me." He met her gaze. "You weren't betrayed. You chose betrayal." She didn't answer. But deep down, she knew she had lost more than a job. She had lost the chance to be decent. The next morning, Amber was called to testify as a witness. She was nervous, but steady. She told everything. The meetings, the dates, the inconsistencies she had seen. Across the room, Mason watched her with pride in his eyes. She was there for him, for Liam, for everything they had built, but also for herself. For the woman who refused to be silenced. As they left the courthouse, Mason held her hand tightly. "You were incredible." Amber looked at him, tired but calm. "I was just honest." They both knew there would still be consequences. But the truth was finally in the open. And that, painful as it was, brought relief that in the days that followed, headlines began to shift. False accusation exposed. Ex-assistant under investigation for fraud. Social project recognized for community impact. The storm was beginning to pass. But the emotional wreckage still echoed in every weary gesture. One night, Amber woke to Liam quietly crying. She went to his room and found him curled up, scared. "I dreamed we lost everything." She held him close. "You know what we never lose?" He shook his head. "The people we truly love." And there, in whispered words and sleepy tears, Amber remembered why she was still here. The next day, Mason showed up with a proposal. "I want to open a new wing at the foundation. In your name. For women who found a way to begin again, even when the world tried to silence them." Amber was moved. "Are you sure?" Mason nodded. "I'm sure that everything you are deserves to be heard." The opening of the Amber Center gathered the community, former partners, and even staff who had quit during the crisis out of loyalty. Liam cut the ribbon with kid scissors and shouted, "Now everyone's gonna know who Amber is." People laughed, applauded, and Amber was moved by the simple, truthful gesture. That night, back at home, Mason gave her a clumsily wrapped gift. Amber opened it carefully. It was a photo frame with a picture of the three of them, drawn by Liam, and a handwritten phrase, "Family is who stays when it hurts." She smiled through tears. "He wrote this?" Mason nodded. "He learned it from you." Amber looked around. The house wasn't the same anymore. Neither were the people in it. Everything had changed. And yet, one thing remained, the certainty that even when the world falls apart, true love rebuilds. And now, nothing and no one could take that away from them. Later that night, Amber stepped out onto the porch with a blanket over her shoulders and a warm cup of tea in her hands. Mason joined her in silence, sitting beside her. For a few moments, they said nothing. They just listened to the night sounds, the gentle rustling of trees, and Liam's steady breathing from the room next door. It felt like, after the storm, silence had returned to being a refuge, not a threat. "I almost lost everything," Mason said quietly. Amber turned to him, gently. "You lost what was never real, and rebuilt what had always been waiting for you." He nodded, emotional. "You helped me see all of this. With patience, with strength, with love." She touched his hand. "And now that you see, the whole world could try to dim it. But you've already learned how to light it from within." They stayed there until late, side by side, unhurried. Because love that survives pain doesn't need grand gestures to prove itself. It reveals itself in staying, in silent care, in the way two hearts choose to remain. Even when everything has been tested. Autumn arrived, covering the city with golden leaves and quieter mornings. Amber watched Liam run barefoot through the garden, a light smile on his face, like someone who had relearned how to be a child. Mason followed close behind, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate and a peaceful look in his eyes. The storm had passed, but what remained was more important than anything they had lost. The bond that I in that house. The scent of home now lingered. The windows were open, the walls decorated with hand-drawn pictures, and the fridge was covered in notes held by colorful magnets. You can do it. Today is a good day to be happy. I believe in you. Simple words, but they built a new kind of permanence. Not the kind that traps, but the kind that welcomes. One morning, Liam called Amber into his room. I want to show you something. She walked in and saw he had drawn an altar, with her and Mason holding hands, and himself in the middle. It's my wish. Amber smiled, moved. And if it came true, what would you say? Liam replied without hesitation, that now, we're a real family. That same day, Mason took Amber to the community center, where they were finishing the new educational greenhouse. This was your idea, he said, but I wanted it to carry our name. She looked at the plaque on the wall. Root space, where love learns to grow. Amber was speechless, not for lack of emotion, but because sometimes the heart speaks better in silence. That night, Mason appeared with a small blue velvet box. No big ceremony, just the 2 of them, in the garden, under the string lights Liam had helped hang. You taught me how to be a man before you taught me how to be loved. And because of that, I don't want to ask you anything. I just want to know if I can walk beside you, one step at a time, wherever you want to go. Amber didn't respond immediately. She simply stood up, held his hand, and said firmly, I'm not saying yes because of a ring. I'm saying yes because you stayed, when it would have been easier to run. And then, the embrace. The kind that seals destiny. No rush, no audience, just truth. Liam came running with a flower in his hand. This is for you, Amber. She knelt and hugged him, emotional. Mason joined them, and in that moment, they understood. It wasn't about a wedding. It was about the home they were building. A home made of daily choices, mutual respect, and a love that didn't need approval. In the days that followed, Amber received letters from people who had followed her story. Silenced women, single mothers, teachers, ordinary people who saw themselves in the way she never gave up. You taught me that staying is also an act of courage, said one message. And Amber kept each one as a reminder of what a sincere presence can do. The ceremony was simple in the garden. Just close friends, Liam in a little suit, and a tree with ribbon vows hanging from its branches. Amber walked in wearing a soft dress and a calm smile. Mason waited for her, eyes glistening. They didn't promise perfection, only presence. During the vows, Mason said, You didn't save me. You showed me I could save myself if I chose to love. Amber replied, And I choose you, not because you're strong, but because you had the courage to be fragile with me. The silence that followed was broken only by applause and the sound of the wind, as if the world itself honored that moment. Liam ran up and hugged their legs. Are we officially a family now? Amber smiled. We already were, my love. Now, everyone else can see it. And the 3 embraced there, under a sky painted in pink tones, as if even nature celebrated the new beginning. After the celebration, Amber and Mason sat on the porch, blankets over their legs and warm mugs in their hands. Are you afraid of the future? She asked. Mason looked at her tenderly. I am. But with you, fear doesn't paralyze me. It just reminds me how much this is worth. She rested her head on his shoulder. Then we'll walk with fear and with love. Weeks passed in quiet simplicity. Amber began leading workshops for women in the community. Mason cut back on business trips, and Liam started sleeping better. The foundation grew, but without rush. It was like their story, one step at a time, with deep roots and light branches. One evening, Amber read one of the letters she had written to herself in the beginning, when she still doubted whether she should stay. If one day you forget who you are, remember how you chose to stay even when everything told you to run. She smiled, holding the folded paper with care. She was no longer the woman who had arrived full of fear. She was now the woman who stayed. Mason walked into the room and saw her. A letter from before? Amber nodded. From when I thought love wasn't for me. He walked over and hugged her from behind. And now, she turned slowly. Now I know. Love doesn't choose you. It's what you choose to build. Every single day. That night, Liam asked to sleep between them. Just for tonight, he said. But they both knew that kind of request held something deeper, a memory of when life hurt, and a silent celebration of how light it had become. They welcomed him into their arms, and once again, silence became the language of that home. The next morning, Amber found a note from Mason on the table. You're not just the love of my life. You're the reason I finally learned what it means to live. And she, eyes full of tears, wrote beneath it. And me? I choose to stay. Every day. Out on the porch, the sun rose slowly. Liam was drawing. Mason made coffee, and Amber looked at the two of them with the rarest certainty of all. The kind of love that's worth it is the kind that stays. The kind that listens. The kind that begins again, even after everything. The kind that becomes home. And so ends the story of the nanny who didn't save a billionaire, but taught him how to be a father, a man, and above all, to be present. Because in the end, it's not power that transforms. It's presence, because, in the end, it's not about grand gestures, empty promises, or perfect stories. It's about who stays when everything falls apart, who holds your hand even when the world lets go. Amber chose to stay. Mason chose to learn. And Liam finally got to grow up surrounded by something no money can buy. Real, everyday, committed. Love. That if this story touched your heart, leave a comment. I choose to stay. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that true love still exists. Share with someone who needs to remember. The most beautiful part of love is when it chooses to stay.